The laughter started before she even cleared the entry gate. Danny Reeves walked into the intake hall of Station Orwell, 7 carrying a single duffel bag over her shoulder and wearing a training uniform that looked like it had been through a war. Because it had. The fabric was faded from deep green to something closer to gray. There were visible stitch lines running across the left sleeve where the material had been torn and sewn back together by hand. A rectangular patch sat on her left shoulder, its edges slightly frayed, showing a simple emblem of crossed rifles over a small planet. Around her, the hall was filled with recruits from dozens of species, all arriving for the Galactic Joint Training Academy's newest intake cycle. The Sovari recruits stood in polished silver uniforms that seemed to glow under the station lights. The HFY wore fitted black gear with golden rank indicators on their 4-sleeve jackets. Even the Brolian recruits, who were built like walking boulders, had clean and well-pressed uniforms that showed their homeworld crests. And then there was Danny, a human woman of average height, lean build, in a uniform that looked like it belonged in a donation bin. That a tall Sovari recruit named Talek was the first to say something. He leaned toward the recruit next to him and spoke loudly enough for half the hall to hear. I did not realize the academy had lowered its standards to accept refugees. Several recruits laughed. A Brolian snorted, which sounded like a small rock slide. A Kesathi recruit named Rena glanced at Danny, took in the state of her uniform, and looked away with clear disinterest. Danny said nothing. She walked to her assigned place in the formation line, set her bag down, and stood with her hands behind her back. Her expression was calm and completely neutral, like she had not heard a single word. Talek was not finished. He stepped slightly out of line to get a better look at her and shook his head with theatrical disappointment. Humans have been part of the galactic community for 12 years now, and they still cannot afford proper clothing for their soldiers. Maybe they spent the budget on the bag, another Sovari added, and the laughter spread again. Danny did not look at them. She did not shift her weight or clench her jaw or do anything that would suggest the comments had landed. She simply stood there, eyes forward, breathing steady, like a person who had long ago learned that words were the least dangerous thing the galaxy could throw at her. More recruits filed in over the next 20 minutes. The hall filled with noise and movement as species that had never shared a room before tried to size each other up. Danny remained still through all of it. A few more recruits passed comments about her uniform. One asked if Earth had a tradition of sending their worst-dressed soldier to represent them. Another wondered aloud if the patches on her uniform were some kind of fashion choice. Rena, the Kesathi, found herself glancing at the human a second time. There was something about the way Danny stood that did not match the jokes. The recruits who were laughing shifted their weight, adjusted their uniforms, looked around for approval from their peers. Danny did none of that. She stood the way someone stands when they have been standing in hard places for a long time and have forgotten how to be uncomfortable. Rena pushed the thought away. Humans were new to the galaxy. They had no major military reputation. Whatever was going on with this one, it was probably nothing to a heavy sound echoed through the hall as the main doors at the front opened. Every recruit straightened up. Instructor Gorith entered the room. He was Fenari, which meant he was enormous. 8 feet of dense gray muscle covered in natural armor plating that looked like cracked stone. His eyes were small and sharp, set deep in a face that had clearly been hit many times and had never once looked bothered by it. He wore the black instructor's coat of the academy, and across his chest were rows of small metal service bars that represented more campaigns than most species had fought in their entire history. Gorith had trained recruits from over 40 species across 3 decades. He had seen every kind of soldier the galaxy could produce. He was known, across multiple systems, as a being who was impossible to impress. He walked to the front of the hall, stopped, and looked at the recruits the way a butcher looks at a delivery. "Welcome to the academy," he said. His voice was low and heavy, like gravel being poured into a metal drum. "You are here because your homeworlds believe you are worth something. Over the next 6 months, I will determine if they were correct." He began walking the line. Each recruit got a brief inspection. Gorith would stop, look the recruit up and down, occasionally adjust a collar or ask a short question, then move on with a nod or a grunt. Talek stood tall when Gorith reached him, and the instructor gave an approving look at his uniform and posture before moving on. Rena received a brief nod and a comment about her stance being acceptable. Then Gorith reached Danny that he looked at her. He opened his mouth to begin his standard assessment. Then his eyes moved to her left shoulder to the small rectangular patch with the crossed rifles and the string of numbers beneath the emblem. He stopped, his mouth closed. His entire body, all 8 feet of armored Fenari warrior, went still in a way that made the air around him feel different. The recruits nearby noticed it immediately. Gorith was staring at the patch like it had spoken to him. The hall began to go quiet. Not because anyone gave an order, but because silence spreads fast when something is wrong with the person in charge. Gorith did not finish his inspection. He turned and walked back to the front of the hall without another word. Nobody moved for a full 5 seconds after Gorith walked away. The instructor had reached the front of the hall and placed both hands behind his back. He was facing the recruits, but his eyes were not seeing them. They were distant, focused somewhere far past the walls of the intake hall, like a man doing calculations he did not enjoy. Talek glanced at the recruits near him, looking for someone who understood what had just happened. No one did. The Sovari shifted uncomfortably and crossed his arms. What was that about? No one answered. Gorith finally spoke. His voice was the same low gravel as before, but something in it had changed. A weight had settled into it. Orientation will continue in Training Hall 4 in 1 hour. Dismissed. That was it. No further inspection. No introductory speech about the Academy's history or its standards. Just a single sentence, and then Gorith walked out of the hall through a side door that led to the instructor's corridor. In 30 years of running intake cycles, Gorith had never once left an inspection unfinished. The recruits broke formation, and the hall immediately filled with confused noise. Talek pushed his way through the crowd toward a group of senior Sovari recruits who had arrived earlier in the week. He demanded to know if this was normal. They told him it was not. It was not even close to normal. Rena watched from across the hall. She had 4 arms and used 2 of them to fold across her chest while the other 2 hung loose at her sides, a Kesathi posture that indicated deep thought. Her sharp eyes moved from the door Gorith had left through to the human woman standing alone near the back of the formation area. Danny had not moved. She was still standing in the same spot, same posture, same calm expression. If the instructor's reaction had surprised her, she did not show it. She picked up her duffel bag, slung it over her shoulder, and began walking toward the barracks corridor. Rena followed at a distance. Not closely, not obviously, but she kept the human in her line of sight as Danny walked down the long gray hallway to the recruit housing block. Danny found her assigned room, stepped inside, and closed the door without looking back. Rena stood in the hallway for a moment, thinking. Then she turned and walked the other way, toward the common area. The common area had information terminals built into the walls. They were standard Galactic database access points that let recruits look up training schedules, academy regulations, and general information about the species they would be training alongside. Rena sat down at one and began searching. She started with the obvious. She typed in human military units and got thousands of results. Humans had a surprisingly large number of military organizations for a species that had only been part of the galactic community for a little over a decade. Rena narrowed the search. She had seen the patch on Danny's shoulder clearly enough. Crossed rifles over planet. A string of characters beneath. She typed in 9th Human Expeditionary Response Unit. The database returned a single entry. It was short. Most of the file was flagged with restricted access markers that Rena did not have clearance to open. What she could see was a brief summary block with basic deployment information. The 9th Human Expeditionary Response Unit, commonly called the 9th Haru, was a rapid deployment infantry force attached to the Earth Coalition's External Defense Command. 4 years ago, it had been deployed to a location called the Moro Corridor. Rena did not recognize the name. She searched for it separately. The Moro Corridor was a narrow transit passage between 2 star systems that served as the only evacuation route for a colony of 200,000 civilians during a Drekker raiding incursion. The Drekker were a species that Rena knew by reputation. They were not soldiers. They were raiders. They moved in massive numbers, overwhelmed defenses, and stripped everything of value, including people. The database entry for the Moro Corridor incident was flagged as a Class Omega event. Rena felt her stomach tighten. Class Omega was the highest severity designation in the Galactic classification system. It was reserved for events involving catastrophic loss or extraordinary circumstances. She read further. The accessible summary said the following. The 9th Haru was deployed with 400 personnel to hold the Moro Corridor evacuation route against a Drekker raiding force estimated at over 12,000. The deployment was expected to last 48 hours until fleet support arrived. Fleet support was delayed due to a secondary engagement in an adjacent system. The 9th Haru held the corridor for 11 days. The summary noted that the civilian evacuation was completed successfully. All 200,000 colonists reached safety. IT did not say how many members of the 9th Haru survived. Rena sat in front of the terminal for a long time. The screen glowed in the dim light of the common area. Around her, other recruits passed through on their way to the barracks, talking and laughing and complaining about the food options. None of them stopped at the terminal. Rena read the summary again. 400 soldiers, 12,000 raiders, 11 days. She was not a military historian, but she understood numbers. She understood what it meant to be outnumbered 30-1 with no reinforcements and no option to retreat because 200,000 people were behind you. She logged off the terminal and stood up slowly. The mess hall was on the other side of the common area. Through the open doorway, Rena could see rows of tables filled with recruits eating and socializing. At a table in the far corner, sitting alone with a tray of plain food, was Danny Reeves. She was eating quietly, not looking at anyone, not looking at anything in particular. She looked like any other recruit having a meal. Rena stared at her from across the room and felt, for the first time since arriving at the academy, that she had absolutely no idea what she was looking at. Talek could not let it go. All through the evening meal and into the first night of the barracks, the Sovari kept circling back to what had happened during the inspection. He told anyone who would listen that Gortha's reaction was probably some kind of test, a mind game designed to unsettle the recruits before training began. That made sense, he said. That was the kind of thing instructors did. Nobody argued with him. But nobody agreed either. The next morning, the recruits gathered in Training Hall 4 for their first official session. The hall was enormous, built to accommodate species of wildly different sizes. Climbing walls scaled for brilliant strength. Speed tracks designed for Kesathi agility. Obstacle courses that shifted configuration every cycle. The ceiling was 30 meters high and lined with observation platforms. Gorth was already there when the recruits arrived. He stood at the center of the hall with his hands behind his back and his face set in the same hard expression he always wore. If last night's reaction had shaken something loose in him, he had sealed it back up. He looked at the recruits the way he always did, like they were problems he had not yet decided were worth solving. Today is assessment, he said. I need to know what each of you can do. Not what your homeworld file says. What you can actually do. He split them into groups and ran them through a standard battery. Close combat drills, endurance circuits, tactical problem solving under time pressure. The work was hard and the pace was brutal, and by the second hour, several recruits had dropped to their knees from exhaustion. Danny moved through every station without complaint. She was not the fastest. She was not the strongest. But she completed every task with a kind of mechanical efficiency that stood out precisely because it did not stand out. She did not hesitate before obstacles. She did not celebrate after completing them. She simply moved from one to the next like someone following a checklist that had long ago been memorized. Rena, working through her own assessment stations nearby, kept finding her eyes drawn to the human. There was something wrong with the way Danny moved. Not wrong in a bad way. Wrong in the way that a knife is wrong when you expect to find spoon. Every motion was stripped of anything unnecessary. No wasted energy. No extra steps. It was the movement pattern of someone who had learned, under extremely unpleasant conditions, that efficiency was not a preference. It was survival. During the close combat assessment, Danny was paired with a brilliant recruit named Goss who outweighed her by at least 300 pounds. The other recruits expected the match to last about 4 seconds. Goss charged forward with the confidence of a species that had never needed to worry about being smaller than anything. Danny sidestepped him so cleanly that Goss stumbled past her and nearly hit the wall. Before he could turn around, she had already repositioned. She did not attack. She waited. Goss charged again, angrier this time. Danny moved at the last possible moment, redirected his momentum with a technique that used his own weight against him, and put him on the ground with a controlled throw that was so smooth it looked rehearsed. Goss lay on the mat, blinking up at the ceiling, trying to understand what had just happened. Danny offered him a hand up. He took it. Gorith, watching from the side, said nothing. He made a note on his assessment pad and moved on. After the session, Talek found himself standing near Rena in the equipment return area. His earlier confidence had dimmed. He had seen the Danny and Goss match, and unlike the jokes he had made the day before, he had no clever comment ready. "She is trained," he said quietly to Rena. "Properly trained." Rena looked at him. "I searched her unit designation last night." Talek raised one eyebrow. Sovari eyebrows were long and angular, so the gesture was dramatic. "And," Rena told him. She kept her voice low, aware that other recruits were nearby. She explained the Moro corridor. The 9th Haru, 400 soldiers deployed to hold an evacuation route for 200,000 civilians. 12,000 Drekker raiders. No fleet support for 11 days. Talek's face changed. Not all at once, but in stages like a building losing its supports one floor at a time. "That is not possible," he said. "The database says Class Omega," Rena replied. "What does that mean for something like this?" "It means either extraordinary success or catastrophic loss. Sometimes both." Talek was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question that Rena had been carrying since the night before. "How many of them survive?" "The file does not say. It is restricted." They both looked across the training hall. Danny was helping another recruit, a young Palori who had struggled with the carry drill, adjust their grip on the weight frame. She showed the technique once, patiently, and then stepped back to let them try. There was no condescension in it, no sense that she was performing charity. She helped the way someone helps when helping is just what you do. "She does not act like someone who survived something like that," Talek said. Rena thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "How would you know what someone like that acts like? Have you ever met one?" Talek did not answer. That evening, word spread. Not quickly and not loudly, but the way information always moves through a group of young soldiers living in close quarters. By the time the lights dimmed in the barracks, most of the recruits had heard some version of the story. The details were incomplete and the source was a restricted database, so there was plenty of room for doubt. But doubt has a hard time surviving when it runs up against the memory of an 8-foot Fenari instructor freezing in his tracks at the sight of a shoulder patch. Commandant Severa had not visited a recruit barracks in 6 years. She was Palori, which meant she was tall and thin with skin the color of deep bronze and eyes that reflected light like polished glass. She had commanded the academy for over a decade and had overseen the training of thousands of recruits from every major species in the galactic community. She was known for being fair, precise, and completely unavailable for anything she considered below her rank. New recruit intake was below her rank when she walked through the barracks door at 6 in the morning, flanked by 2 academy staff officers. Every recruit in the corridor froze. Some of them had never seen her in person. The ones who had recognized immediately that something unusual was happening. Severa walked with the kind of authority that does not need to announce itself. Her boots made sharp, even sounds on the metal floor. She stopped in the center of the barracks common area and said, in a clear voice that carried through every open door, "Recruit Reeves, present yourself." Silence. Doors opened along the corridor. Recruits stepped out in various states of readiness, some fully dressed, some still pulling on their training jackets. Talek appeared from his room and stood against the wall, watching. Rena was already dressed and standing near the common area entrance, her forearms folded in a posture of alert attention. Danny stepped out of her room at the far end of the hall. She was wearing the same faded uniform, the same patched shoulder. She walked the length of the corridor without hurrying, came to a stop in front of Severa, and stood at attention. Severa looked at her for a long moment. Her glass-like eyes moved to the patch on Danny's shoulder, held there, and then returned to Danny's face. "I reviewed your service file last night," Sever said. Her voice was calm and measured. "I requested it from Earth Coalition Command after Instructor Gorath submitted an unusual note in his intake report." Danny said nothing. She stood still and waited. Severa continued. "It is an honor to have you at this academy, Recruit Reeves. I want you to know that your presence here is recognized and valued." She said this in front of every recruit in the barracks. She said it with the same tone she might use to address a decorated officer, not a first-week recruit in a faded uniform. Then Severa gave Danny a slow, formal nod. It was the kind of nod that carried weight in military culture across species. Not a greeting, not a casual acknowledgement. It was a sign of respect from someone who did not give it easily. Severa turned and left the barracks. Her staff officers followed. The door closed behind them, and the sound of her boots faded down the corridor. The silence she left behind was heavy. Talek was the first to break it. He stepped forward from the wall and looked at Danny with an expression that was no longer mocking, no longer dismissive, but genuinely confused. "What did you do?" he asked. Danny looked at him. "I served," she said, and then she turned and walked back toward her room. Talek looked at Rena. Rena looked at the other recruits. The question was on all of their faces. Rena decided it was time. She gathered the group in the common area, maybe 20 recruits in total, and told them what she had found. She explained it plainly. The Morrow Corridor, a narrow passage between two star systems. The only evacuation route for 200,000 civilians fleeing a Drekker raiding force. The 9th Human Expeditionary Response Unit deployed to hold the line. 400 soldiers, against over 12,000 Drekker. The fleet was supposed to arrive in 48 hours, Rena said. It did not arrive for 11 days. The room was quiet. 11 days. A Brullian recruit repeated slowly. Rena nodded. The evacuation was completed. All 200,000 civilians reached safety. A Sovari recruit near the back asked the question quietly. "How many of the 400 survived?" Rena shook her head. "The file is restricted. I could not access the casualty report." Danny's voice came from behind them. No one had noticed her return. She was standing at the edge of the common area, leaning against the doorframe with her hands in her pockets. Her face was calm, but there was something behind her eyes that had not been there before. Something old and tired. 31, she said. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. 31 out of 400. 369 dead. Not in a single battle. Over 11 days. 11 days of holding a line that should have broken in hours, while 200,000 people walked to safety behind them. Nobody spoke. Danny did not add anything. She did not explain how it happened. She did not describe the fighting or the conditions or the fear. She gave them a number and let the number do its own work. Then she pushed off the doorframe and walked away. Rena watched her go. She thought about the faded uniform, the stitch lines, the hand-sewn repairs. She thought about the patch on Danny's shoulder and what it meant to wear the last surviving copy of a unit emblem that 369 people would never wear again. Talek sat down heavily on one of the common area benches. He stared at the floor. His earlier jokes about the humans' clothing felt like they belonged to a different person in a different lifetime. 31, he said to no one, and 01 answered him. There was nothing to say. The training changed after that morning. Not the schedule. Not the exercises, not the instructors, or the drills, or the pace. Those stayed exactly the same. What changed was the way people looked at the woman in the faded uniform. Recruits who had laughed at her clothes 2 days ago now stepped aside when she passed in the corridor. Not out of fear, out of something they did not have a word for yet. It was the feeling of standing near something that had been through fire and come out the other side still standing, still quiet, still steady. And Danny made it harder for them to process because she did not act like a hero. She showed up to training on time. She completed every drill. She did not push herself to the front or try to lead when it was not her turn. When a team exercise required someone to take point, she waited to see if anyone else volunteered first. When no one did, she stepped forward without complaint. When someone else wanted the role, she stepped back without e.g. confuse the recruits. especially the ones from species where military reputation was worn openly and talked about constantly. The Sovari had an entire system of ceremonial sashes and pins that advertised every campaign, every commendation, every notable engagement. A Sovari survivor of something like the Moro Corridor would have arrived at the academy draped in enough metal to set off a security scanner. Danny wore a faded uniform with hand-stitched patches and said nothing about any of it. Rena was the one who finally understood IT happened during a rest period between afternoon drills. The recruits were sitting in the shade of the training hall's outer wall, drinking water and catching their breath. Rena was next to Danny for the first time, close enough to get a proper look at the uniform. She noticed something she had missed before. The stitch lines were not random. The repairs on the left sleeve followed a long diagonal pattern, the kind of tear that would be made by a blade or a piece of shrapnel dragged across the arm. The patch over the right side of the chest was not decorative. It covered a hole. A round hole, roughly the size of a Drecker spike round. These were not tailor's fixes. They were field repairs. The kind of repairs a soldier makes when they're still in the fight, and their uniform is the only thing between their skin and the next hit. Rena looked at the stitch work more carefully. It was rough but strong, made with thick thread that did not match the fabric. She had seen enough field medicine in her own training to recognize the technique. Someone had sewn these repairs quickly, under pressure, probably in the dark. "You kept it," Rena said quietly. Danny looked at her. "Kept what?" "The uniform." From the corridor. Danny glanced down at her own sleeve. She ran her thumb along one of the stitch lines without thinking about it, the way a person touches a scar they have carried for years. "Yes." "What?" Danny was quiet for a moment. Around them, other recruits were talking and stretching and complaining about sore muscles. "Normal sounds. Safe sounds. On Earth," Danny said, "there's a tradition. If your unit goes through something bad and you make it out, you keep your gear. Not because it is still good, because it remembers." Rena did not fully understand. Remembers what? Everyone who wore the same thing and did not come home. Rena looked at the patch on Danny's shoulder. The crossed rifles. The small planet. The string of numbers. She suddenly understood that the numbers were not a unit code. They were a date. The date the 9th Aru was deployed to the Moro Corridor. The first night was the worst, Danny said, so quietly that Rena almost missed it. "They hit us before we finished setting up defensive positions. We lost 60 people in the first 3 hours. After that, it was just holding. Every hour, every shift, just holding." She said it without emotion. Not because she did not feel it, but because she had felt it so many times that the words had been worn smooth, like stones in a river. By day 4, we knew the fleet was not coming on time. Our commanding officer gathered everyone who was still standing and told us the truth. He said we were probably not going to make it. He said anyone who wanted to try to break through the Drecker line and escape could do so without judgment. Danny paused. Nobody left. Rena felt something tighten in her chest. Why? Because the civilians were still behind us. They were still walking. Families. Children. Old people who could not move fast. They needed every hour we could give them. The training hall buzzed with normal activity around them. Somewhere nearby, a Brolian was arguing with a Sovari about the scoring of a drill. A group of Palori recruits were practicing hand signals. The galaxy continued as usual. 11 days, Rena said. 11 days, Danny confirmed. She looked at the patch on her shoulder one more time. The last 3 days, there were fewer than 50 of us. We did not sleep. We rotated positions every 2 hours and kept firing. She stopped talking, not because she was upset, but because she had reached the end of what she was willing to share. There was more. Rena could see it in the way Danny's eyes went flat and distant for just a moment before she pulled herself back. "The uniform carries them," Danny said. "Every tear, every patch, every stitch. That is why I wear it." Rena nodded slowly. She did not say anything else. Some things do not need a response. They just need someone to sit quietly and understand. They sat together in silence until the next drill began. 6 months passed faster than any of them expected. The recruits who had arrived at Station Orwell, 7 as strangers from different worlds, had become something close to a unit. Not a perfect one. There were still arguments, still cultural misunderstandings, still moments where a Brollian's idea of personal space clashed with a Kasathi's need for distance. But they trained together, failed together, improved together, and slowly, without any of them noticing exactly when it happened, they began to trust each other. Danny was at the center of that change, not because she asked to be, but because people kept finding their way to her. She never gave speeches. She never told war stories in the barracks at night while the others gathered around. She trained, she helped when she saw someone struggling, and she kept to herself the rest of the time. But that was exactly why people trusted her. In a place full of recruits trying to prove themselves, Danny was the one person who had nothing to prove and knew it. Talek was the one who surprised everyone. 3 weeks after the commandant's visit, he found Danny alone in the equipment room after a long training session. She was cleaning a set of practice weapons, something the recruits were supposed to do themselves, but often left for the maintenance staff. Talek stood in the doorway for a moment, looking uncomfortable in a way that Sovari rarely allowed themselves to look. Then he walked in and sat down across from her. "I want to apologize," he said. Danny looked up from the weapon she was cleaning. She studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, the things I said when you arrived. About your uniform. About your species." He paused. "They were ignorant. I did not know what I was looking at." Danny set down the weapon and gave him her full attention. "You had no way of knowing. That does not excuse it." "No," Danny agreed, "but it explains it. And I have been called worse things by worse people in worse places. I'm not going to hold it against you." Talek looked like he wanted to say more, but could not find the words. Danny picked up the weapon again and continued cleaning. After a moment, she pushed a second weapon and a cloth across the table toward him. He looked at it, then at her, and then began cleaning without another word. They worked in silence for 20 minutes. It was the beginning of something that was not quite friendship, but was close enough to matter. Rena and Danny became genuine friends. The Kasathi's sharp mind and Danny's quiet steadiness balanced each other in ways that showed up on the training field and in the mess hall conversations that stretched late into the evening. Rena asked questions, not about the corridor but about Earth, about human food and music, and the way humans raise their children and why they kept pets. Danny answered everything with patience and occasional dry humor that caught Rena off guard. One night, sitting in the common area after the other recruits had gone to bed, Rena asked the question she had been carrying for months. "Why do you never tell people about the corridor? When they make assumptions about you, when they underestimate you, you could end it in one sentence. But you never do." Danny thought about it for a while. Rena had learned that Danny's silences were not empty. They were full of something being carefully sorted. "The patch is not for other people," Danny finally said. "It is not a trophy. It is not a badge. It is a promise." "A promise to who?" "To the ones who stayed." Danny touched the shoulder patch with her fingertips. "They did not hold that line for 11 days so that I could use their sacrifice to win arguments with people who do not know any better." Rena looked at the patch, the crossed rifles, the date, the frayed edges. She thought about 369 names that would never be spoken in this academy, on this station, in this part of the galaxy. Names that only 31 people in the entire universe still remembered. "They must have been extraordinary," Rena said. Danny shook her head. "They were ordinary. That was the whole point. Ordinary people who decided that 200,000 strangers were worth dying for. You do not need to be extraordinary for that. You just need to decide." At the end of the training cycle, Instructor Gorith submitted his evaluations. His report on Danny Reeves was 3 lines long, which was unusual for a being known for detailed assessments. It read, "Recruit Reeves is the finest example of what a soldier should be that I have encountered in 30 years of training. She carries her history without using it as a weapon. I have nothing to teach her that she has not already learned the hard way." The graduation ceremony was held in the main hall of Station Orwell 7. Recruits from every species stood in formation as Commandant Severa delivered closing remarks. Danny stood in line in the same faded uniform, the same patched shoulder, the same quiet posture she had carried since the first day. Months later, a new intake group arrived at a young Sovari recruit, freshly arrived and full of confidence, walked into the intake hall and saw a human woman crossing the corridor in a worn-out uniform with visible stitch lines and a frayed patch on the shoulder. The Sovari opened his mouth to make a comment. An older recruit, one who had been there for the previous cycle, grabbed the young one by the arm. The grip was firm. "Do not," the older recruit said, very quietly. "You have no idea what that uniform has been through." The young Sovari closed his mouth. Danny walked past without hearing any of it. Her hand brushed the patch on her shoulder as she turned the corner, a gesture so small and so automatic that she probably did not even know she was doing it. 369 names, stitched into every thread, still carried, still remembered, still walking through the halls of a galaxy that was only just beginning to understand what it meant to be human.